Hello everybody, Andrew Field here. There have been, obviously, some major events that have happened in the past week, so I'm going to quickly run through them. So on February 21st, Putin declared regions held by Russian separatists as independent and ordered Russian forces into the separatist regions of Ukraine. Um, White House Secretary Jen Psaki said Biden would issue an executive order, which he did, prohibiting U.S. investment in the two regions. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called Putin's actions a blatant violation of international law. British Foreign Minister Liz Truss tweeted, "The UK will announce new sanctions on Russia." The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting, so this was all happening very quickly. The U.S. warned the UN it has credible info showing Russia has a list of Ukrainians to be killed or sent to camps, which is some very damning news. That they have targets. Obviously, the Ukraine's President Zelensky's one, but a lot of targets, and can only imagine. So Germany did a big move early on, halting the Russian-German Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline after he ordered troops in the two breakaway regions. That is huge news because that pipeline has been, they've been trying to build that for several years now, and it's supposed to be this massive natural gas pipeline that's supposed to greatly benefit Germany and Russia. So that would, in hindrance to Germany, they took that step early on. So I applaud them for that. The UK also took massive action early on because they sanctioned 5 Russian banks and 3 wealthy individuals. The White House called this troop movement of Russia an invasion. The Irish government also announced sanctions against Russia. Biden spoke about spoke about Russia moving troops into eastern Ukraine. Said they were also a violation of international law, and Biden announced sanctions on Russia shortly after, targeting 2 financial institutions, Russian sovereign debt, and Russian elites and their family members that are connected to Putin, which I think was a good first round of sanctions. The U.S. sanctioned Nord Stream 2, the parent company of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I think is important because even though Germany said they'd halted, if they ever decided to continue the pipeline, that's a setback that they'll have to deal with. The U.S. sent additional troops and equipment to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 3 countries that border Russia that are NATO allies, that are key to watch because if Russia were to attack any of those 3 countries, even though they're right next to Russia, since they're in the NATO alliance, that would mean World War III. Ukraine declared a state of emergency. Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke directly to the Russian people during an emotional video. He was saying when Putin announced they would move troops into the 2 breakaway regions that Putin did not answer his call. There was another UN Security Council session while this was going on in New York from Ukraine's request, and then Putin gave a speech saying his troops would move into the region shortly after he claimed them to be independent. He said that he would move Russian troops into the region. So I just want to point out that U.S. intelligence was right all along when they called out weeks prior that Russia's movement of over 175,000 troops on the border of Ukraine, that was actually going to be an invasion from the beginning. The U.S. predicted that correctly. Putin called it a special military operation. I fucking hate Putin, by the way. It's just, I never liked him, but this has gone way too far, even for him. In the speech, he was saying he wanted to rebuild the Soviet Union. So Russia, who was formerly the USSR, right, the Soviet Union, they were communist. Now Russia is fascist, meaning they're trying to bring back something, and they're on the extreme right side of things. So it's interesting to see how that happened. But they're in the same political category as Nazi Germany back then, so wanted to point that out. Biden met with leaders of the G7, He called the actions of Russia moving troops in those regions unprovoked and unjustified. Ukraine said a full-scale invasion began right after the fact. Um, Biden addressed the nation again, saying the world would hold Russia accountable. The first indication on a death counter was saying that 40 Ukrainians died shortly after Russia moved into the eastern region of Ukraine. The latest numbers I've seen has been 100 dead, 300 over 100 Ukrainians dead, over 300 wounded, but these numbers are far below the actual numbers, I believe. I haven't seen the official numbers from any news source over the past few days, so I can only imagine how high the death counter is from Ukrainians and Russians. So, yeah, it's really unfortunate what's been going on. 100% Russia's fault. Um, but yeah, I guess we won't know the death counter, it seems like, until after the conflict has ended. And I just want to say that I pray so much for the country of Ukraine. I can only imagine how difficult it is for that country. When they were part of the USSR, they, were captured and, didn't have a lot of rights and, were captured right after World War II. They didn't have a choice in the matter. And they finally were able to break off when the Soviet Union collapsed and gave up the nuclear weapons it possessed. Um, and also, I don't know if you know, but Chernobyl is actually in Ukraine, so they experienced that whole crisis that happened during the Cold War. And the Ukraine at first was held by someone who was not for democracy, I believe, who was an authoritarian. But the Ukrainian people prevailed and were able to get democracy into Ukraine to be a full-fledged democracy. And they get to this point and now have to deal with the fact that Russia's attacking them hard, and I really hope the best for them, but they are really outmatched right now in terms of strength of military. So it's really unfortunate what's been happening here. Oh yeah, and fucking China. Believe this, right? China, after Russia invaded Ukraine, this was what China had to say. They failed to even condemn Russia's actions of invading a foreign country, and actually criticized the U.S. and saying the U.S. was to blame for Russia's actions for hyping up the prospect of war. They said that China was hyping up the prospect of war just because the U.S. was saying they were just providing intelligence, trying to stop Russia from invading, which didn't work. So China's really disgusting, and they better not side with Russia, because if we go to a world war and China's siding with Russia, obviously that ups the stakes, but I'm fine with taking China down as well. So the foreign ministers of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania jointly called for the strongest possible sanctions. Obviously, you can imagine that these countries were very alarmed at the fact that they were taking over Ukraine, because even though they're NATO allies, they still are very close to Russia in the sphere of influence, so they were rightly worried. So they called the strongest possible sanctions, and the Baltic nations and Poland, which all border Russia, triggered Article 4 of the Alliance's founding treaty. Lithuania declared a state of emergency as well. Russian airstrikes soon after the invasion started crippled Ukraine's defenses, with Russian troops entering by air and sea, along with much land forces that were being reported. Belarus definitely needs to pay. This this horrible government of Belarus allowed Russian troops to attack Ukraine and walk through Belarus, so they should be sanctioned as well, which I think they were, at least by the UK, but they should deal with international sanctions as well. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson classified the attack as a catastrophe for Europe. This is the first major war in Europe since, I believe, since World War II. Yeah, Kenya is a bastard to the United States. the United Nations Security Council said he understands the Kremlin's, well, he understands the Kremlin's acts of aggression, and you know, like he's saying he was trying to relate that to colonialism, and was standing very much with Ukraine, so that was a good thing. Putin seemed to threaten nuclear strikes if any country strikes Russia in its retaliation. Um, he didn't specifically say nuclear strikes, but I believe the specific words that Putin used was that if any country struck Russia, they would be hit hard. Like I believe what he was saying was they would be hit hard like no other country has ever had dealt with before. So that implicates nuclear bombs. Um, Soon after, Russia seized Antonov Airport in Ukraine. This was a rare sign of bipartisanship. 43 U.S. Congress members in both parties sent a letter to President Biden urging Biden to receive authorization from Congress before involving U.S. forces in the Ukraine-Russia war. People waved Ukrainian flags in Chicago over Kennedy Expressway to show support over Russian troops, and I've seen lights from the Eiffel Tower, and I've seen international support for Ukraine, which is a good thing to see that the world stands with Ukraine, and basically nobody's siding with Russia and saying that Russia's in the right, which is an important thing, because if it were the other way around, this would be much more complicated, but yeah. Let's see. Russian troops captured Chernobyl, which was the nuclear plant I talked about earlier, that they caused that catastrophe as the USSR. So this story really captivated my attention, and obviously I've been following the crisis all along as I talked in my previous videos, but this story is really inspirational, and it tells you the amount of faith and courage that Ukrainians have, and this is why I feel so strongly to support Ukraine no matter what. So there were 13 Ukrainian soldiers that were defending Snake Island, a small island that Ukraine possessed. A Russian warship came to this island, right? They told Ukrainians to surrender, and Ukrainian soldiers, knowing they stood no chance against this Russian warship, they said, "Go fuck yourself." That is their words, and they were shortly after killed. I hope they go down as legends, even if this conflict is not super long. That's such an amazing thing, knowing that, there's no chance you're going to be able to take out a Russian warship. They didn't have any type of artillery, it seems like, to take on the warship, but to, protest that, risking their lives, it's amazing. They could have just surrendered and been prisoners, but they weren't going to surrender to Russia. President Zelensky named the 13 soldiers heroes of Ukraine. Biden announced new sanctions against Russia, I believe a day or two into this attack, which included new limitations on what can be imported to Russia, sanctioned 4 more Russian banks, added names of more Russian elites, and said sanctions that the U.S. is imposing will affect Russia for years to come. It will hurt their high-tech and military investment. Russian ruble, their currency, and stocks fell hard shortly after all these sanctions came to fruition. Biden says U.S. forces will not be sent to Ukraine. And here's the thing. I understand the international perspective. Of course I do. Especially since Russia is talking about nuclear war. The world is doing everything possible to avoid global conflict, which I applaud. I think it's a great thing that we are not rushing into a war, right? But my opinion is they've been very clear on opposing invading Ukraine, right? And, they've tried everything. They've tried sanctions and more sanctions and tried diplomatically everything they can possibly do. And it may end up working. It seems like the leverage is starting to be there because these sanctions are so harsh. So we'll have to see with that, especially since Biden said years to come. It sounds like these sanctions are going to hit Russia more and more over time. I mean, affect them more and more over time. But in my opinion, the world basically is saying, Ukraine, we stand with you. We want you to beat Russia. We want to help you. But we will not send our forces in there because we do not want World War III to start, right? And nuclear holocaust and that sort of thing, right? But to me, when Putin uses the words wants to build back the Soviet Union, in my opinion, he's not going after just Ukraine. He wants to literally build back the Soviet Union. Putin was a KGB officer for the USSR. He held a role in the USSR, knows the USSR. I believe that statement needs to be taken very, very seriously. There are many countries that border Russia that I'm sure Putin would want to go after. So I believe that if Ukraine does fall, I do not believe it is the end. I believe that Russia will try to go after other countries. We saw it with Ukraine. They had no reason to go after Ukraine. They tried to build all these false reasonings. They built up their army on their border and ended up attacking. So I believe that nothing is off the table. I think the world needs to take this very, very seriously, especially Putin's words, because he has one of the biggest militaries in the world. So I personally believe the US and NATO allies should help Ukraine because even though they're not a NATO member, they were trying to get a part of NATO, and I don't think they were able to because they've been in constant conflict with Russian separatists for the past 7 years or 8 years. So I think they should get involved, but we're going to have to see. The US and NATO are doing a lot right now, so we're going to have to see in the next couple of days. So yes, NATO actually has been strengthened after the attack, which is very ironic because Russia said their main thing was to weaken NATO and worried about NATO's influence, but he's just upgraded NATO and strengthened their alliance, like I said. Additional troops were sent to Germany. Russian forces are close to Ukraine's capital. At this point, UN Refugee Agency estimated 100,000 Ukrainians are being displaced. Zelensky warned that Russian invasion is a start of war against all Europe. President Zelensky is very brave. He's staying in Kiev. He is not fleeing. He's going to stay there till the end, he said. Russia has been barred from Eurovision over Ukraine invasion, sorry. Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican turned into evil Putin, said Biden should sanction the lifestyles of rich mobsters, which I thought was pretty cool. It seems like Republicans are on board. Biden put sanctions on Russian leader Putin himself, which was a good thing. The EU sanctioned the Russian president and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Liquor stores in Canada and the US are refusing to sell Russian vodka, so I do like all the steps that we're taking to limit Russia. Poland sent trucks of ammo and 10,000 tons of fuel to Ukraine. Russia issued an ominous warning to both Sweden and Finland should they join NATO with military and political consequences. And this is what I'm talking about, the fact that not only is he going to try to advance in these countries that are surrounding Russia, but think about it. If you're a country that borders Russia and you see Russia invade Ukraine, wouldn't you want to be a part of NATO? So I feel like there's going to be a good amount of countries that are going to want to join NATO because they see Ukraine, and NATO is saying they can't get involved because Ukraine is not a member. So all of these countries, I believe, are going to try to get into NATO, and Russia could use that as an excuse to try and invade their country. So things are very tense right now, obviously. This is great news. For the first time ever, the NATO response force was activated as a defense measure. So it wasn't to send to Ukraine, but as a defense measure, it's still a huge deal. In response to the invasion of Ukraine, and it's up to 40,000 troops for a deterrence and defense role that have been readied should Russia attack any NATO ally. Ukrainian forces regained control of capital Kyiv streets after Russian troops and undercover units in civilian clothes tried to enter the capital city. There's a lot of misinformation being spread by Russia, so to stay politically informed, you need to determine what is Russian propaganda or Russian lies as well. Germany agreed to send weapons to Ukraine, including 400 anti-aircraft missiles, 1,000 tank-busting rockets, and 500 surface-to-air missiles, along with 14 armored vehicles. Germany was previously only going to send 5,000 helmets. It sparked mockery around the world, and Germany cited legacy of war guilt as a reason for not shipping lethal weapons to conflict zones. I mean, I kind of understand that Germany has a very dark history in the past, including both world wars, in terms of where they stood. So they were saying that they didn't want to send any weapons to any conflicts, but they realized that this conflict involves where it's a fight for democracy, and you know, Ukraine's basically fighting for all of us right now. So I'm very happy with the decision by Germany to send these weapons to Ukraine. I think it's a great move by them. The State Department said it would provide up to $350 million in additional military aid, and I also want to make clear that in previous years the U.S. has sent a good deal of money to Ukraine, but they're sending this additional $350 million. And Biden has also asked Congress to give an additional $6.4 billion in additional funding. So yeah, so that the U.S. is doing a lot. They're not getting involved militarily at this point, but they are doing a lot in economic sanctions, money to Ukraine. They're doing a lot of steps. So um, YouTube and Facebook blocked Russian channels from earning U.S. dollars, which is good, and Momentum's beginning to kick Russia out of SWIFT, which is a worldwide interbank financial intercommunication. Germany is trying to limit it because they're worried about getting hurt by that decision. U.S. defense officials said Ukraine's forces were putting up a very determined resistance. A lot of civilians have gotten weapons and are willing to fight. It seems that, a lot of people are migrating, at least to Western Ukraine or in Europe, but a lot of the men have stayed behind, and Ukraine seems very, very committed to fight to the last man, which is, I love the mentality that they're doing whatever possible to stop Russia from taking over their country and controlling their government and all of that. I applaud their efforts. They're very, very determined right now. Um, so yeah, and right before I was set to make this video, I saw the EU, UK, US, and Canada announced powerful new sanction plans, including kicking off some Russian banks out of SWIFT financial network, which will really cripple Russia's economy. And I saw videos of Russians protesting war with Ukraine in Moscow, and I think there was another one in St. Petersburg. So there is a lot of Russians that seem to be pissed off about this, and they should be, because Russia is made as a villain. They always were a villain, but the world is seeing how much of a villain Russia is. Um, you know, I said that I don't have a lot of sympathy for Russians right now, but in Russia, because even though the media is state-run and it's hard to get information, they went from all this time of having dictators in the USSR. They tried democracy, not really, and now have an authoritarian dictator in Russian, Vladimir Putin, who has been in power in Russia for about 30 years. So it's kind of ridiculous, and if I were them, I wouldn't be living in Russia. But I do like the fact that they're protesting. They seem to have some semblance of an idea of what's going on. So that was good, at least. U.S. women's national team, U.S. Soccer Federation settled a lawsuit over equal pay for $24 million. Indoor masking is no longer necessary across most of the U.S., CDC has said. The jury found three men, Gregory McMichael, Travis McMichael, and William Bryan, guilty of killing Ahmaud Arbery. So these men were already serving life sentences, but they got convicted on federal hate crime case, so that was just an extra step and a good thing. And to end it off, I just want to say that neuroscientists, for the first time ever, recorded the brain activity of an 87-year-old as he died from a heart attack, suggesting that our lives do flash before our eyes before we die, which was pretty amazing data. Unfortunately, this person passed away, but for them to be able to record the activity of the brain as it was dying, it's an amazing scientific feat. I'm sorry that this video is a bit longer, but there was just so much information with the timeline of Russia invading and this whole war that started. So thank you all for watching. I hope you have a great day, and yeah, thank you very much.